Please, could you tell us a bit about yourself and your background within ALLFIE and the disability rights movement?
So my name's Tara Flood. I'm a disabled person. I'm also a disability rights activist. I live in London and I've been involved in the disability rights movement for, a long time, more than 20 years maybe. But I have a very strong link to ALLFIE, to the Alliance for Inclusive Education, in that I was the director of ALLFIE for nearly 14 years, from 2006 to 2019. And during that time, we had some really exciting times. At the time, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, when I first joined, was still being discussed. As you may or may not know, it wasn't ratified by the UK government. It wasn't accepted by the UK government until 2009. So I was involved representing ALLFIE in New York as part of those discussions. So really exciting times, and really important that ALLFIE was right at the heart of those discussions.
Next question. What are the UN-CRPD in Article 24 in layman's terms?
So the UN-CRPD, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is an international human rights treaty that is created and I suppose looked after by the United Nations. And a human rights treaty is a document that I suppose sets out responsibilities that countries' governments have to protect the human rights of the citizens of that country. And what's really important about the UN-CRPD is that it's the first human rights treaty that recognises disabled people explicitly. So all other human rights treaties before the UN-CRPD included disabled people under the description of "and others." Essentially, we were invisible in all other previous human rights treaties. So that makes the UN-CRPD super important for disabled people, because suddenly our human rights as human beings and as citizens are now visible and now recognised. The important thing about human rights is they are indivisible. They cannot be taken away from us because they are what makes us human. No, they will be abused and they will be violated, absolutely, but they are what makes us human beings, and so therefore we cannot be without human rights. So Article 24 sets out very clearly what a human right to inclusive education means for disabled people, including disabled children and young people. It defines what inclusive education means, and it means something different from segregated education. What's also important is the general comment number 4 that came out after the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was ratified, because that gives clear guidance to countries' governments about how to implement Article 24 of the Convention. So one of the important things to remember about Article 24 is that it's subject to a progressive realisation of rights. And what that means, that sounds technical, but what that really means is that any government that signs the convention has a period of time in which to realise that particular article, i.e. how to turn that article into action in their own country. So that's really important. And there are other articles within the convention where that also applies. And I think it applies to Article 24 because everyone realised when we were talking about what needed to be included in Article 24, that for some countries it could take quite some time creating inclusive education systems, because don't forget, in the vast majority of countries, disabled children and young people aren't going to school at all, let alone going into inclusive education. So there's a huge amount of work to be done.
What did you do as ALLFIE director to get the UK government to sign and ratify the UNCRPD?
So when I was ALLFIE's director, the discussions around the UN Convention were still going on in New York. So at the time, ALLFIE didn't have any money to send me to New York. So I got another organisation that was called the Centre for the Studies on Inclusive Education to pay for me to go so that I could represent ALLFIE, but I could also represent CSIE. But it meant that I was actually there in the heart of the discussions in New York, which was really exciting. It was an opportunity to talk to representatives from different countries' governments, but also, as some people will know, the UNCRPD was the first human rights treaty of the 21st century, but also it was the first human rights treaty that involved ordinary people in those discussions. So usually human rights treaties only allow countries' governments to attend those discussions, but the what is called the civil society, so charities, campaigning organisations, in our case, disabled person-led organisations, were in New York working with all sorts of people, government representatives, people at the UN, to work out what we wanted to include in the text of the UNCRPD. So I was involved in the writing of Article 24 and other articles, but particularly Article 24 because my expertise was inclusive education. And I was working alongside people that you may also know, Richard Reeser and others. And it was a difficult conversation because there were people there that wanted to include choice of segregated education. And we were very clear that that wasn't a human rights issue. The issue was about having a human right to be included in mainstream education, and that a choice, as we know, does nothing more than muddy the waters. We know that from our experience in the UK. What we want is a choice of different types of inclusive schools, because we know, don't we, that if there was a choice for segregated education, we would never have a genuine right to inclusive education, and we would not see an end to segregated education.
How did you get Article 24 for education added on to the UNCRPD?
Education was always going to be part of the UNCRPD. I think the role that I played, Richard Reeser played, and others was making sure that Article 24 was clearly a right to an inclusive education. I think had there not been disability rights activists there and those of us with expertise around inclusive education, I think we may well have had an article on education that allowed for segregated provision. If we look at other conventions like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the article on education there barely mentions disabled children. In fact, disabled children and young people are barely mentioned in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Rights of the Child at all. And that was one of the levers that we had to creating a UNCRPD in the first place. That other human rights treaties barely mention disabled people at all. So I think the important point is that Article 24 is not only focused on education, but it's focused particularly on inclusive education and an ending to segregated education. It clearly states in the general comment number 4, which came out after the ratification of the Human Rights Treaty, um, what inclusive education is, and it's not an education system that separates out disabled children and young people. There is a responsibility on countries' governments to create education systems that are mainstream and that work and support and encourage and have disabled children alongside our non-disabled peers. That's really important.
Within that, what has the UK government actually signed up for? What have the UK government done or not done to implement what they agreed to and then what they haven't agreed?
I think one of the big huge disappointments for me and other disabled people, disabled children, young people and families, and generally the inclusive education movement in the UK, is that the UK government, they were one of the first to ratify the convention. During that ratification process, decided to place caveats against Article 24, particularly with regard to the definition of a general education system. The UK government wanted to continue to include segregated special schools in their definition of a general education system. They also wanted to be able to continue to be allowed to place disabled children and young people, including young people with special educational needs, in residential settings away from their home environment. And for me, that's hugely disappointing because it tells us just how little aspiration the UK government has for the potential for creating an inclusive education system, but also, much more sadly, I think, that how little it values the education and the future of disabled children and young people in this country, that they couldn't possibly consider um, thinking about what an inclusive education system could look like, or working with organisations like ALLFIE and other organisations that have worked on designing models of inclusive education for decades now. And I think it's shameful, given that we have a Human Rights Act in this country. It's shameful that the UK government tries to talk so positively about all the things that it's done for disabled people in this country, and yet the one thing it could have done in supporting the next generation of disabled children, of future generations of disabled children, to have the luxury, have access to an inclusive education, it's the one thing they failed on. And it is a shameful situation that we live in a country that is very well resourced. This is a rich country, and yet it couldn't make that one step towards developing an inclusive education system. It's a shameful thing, and I know that ALFIE continues to campaign for the removal of those two caveats.
So what work is being done by the UNCRPD Monitoring Committee to scrutinise government on this?
So in 2017, the UK government was up for its first scrutiny by the UN-CRPD Monitoring Committee. And I was still director of ALFIE at the time, and we were heavily involved in creating the civil society report that, from our perspective, set out how well or not we think the UK government was doing in terms of implementing the UN-CRPD articles. So it's one thing ratifying the convention, it's a whole different thing implementing the articles. And I think, let's be honest, the UK government has done a pretty shameful job in implementing any of the articles of the convention. And I think we put in a very strong, very well evidenced report that showed how poorly the UK government had done in implementing any of the articles of the convention. And we submitted that report alongside Inclusion London, DPAC, lots of other organisations across the country. And I think what was really good at the time is that we were able to submit a summary from England, Scotland, North of Ireland and Wales. It was a joint summary report. That was very powerful for when we went to Geneva to present our report, because it showed a really united front from disabled people's own organisations. And the monitoring committee were really good in listening to all of our concerns, and they were very good in questioning UK government representatives based on the evidence that we'd submitted. And I think what was very powerful coming out of those conversations and those meetings is that the chair of the monitoring committee, Teresa Degener, said in her summing up that she felt that the government, the UK government, was guilty of systemic and gross violations against disabled people in the framework of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That is powerful stuff. UN human rights treaties, monitoring bodies rarely talk in those kind of terms. So that tells you how serious they think the violations have been against disabled people in this country, and they include disabled children and young people in their concerns. So I think the government, you won't be surprised to know, have pretty much ignored that the report that came back, the General Observations Report, and I'm not aware that the UK government have done anything since 2017 to rectify that situation.
So in relation to all of this, what can the young people do to campaign for their own human rights?
I think the important thing for young disabled people is to educate themselves about human rights and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I would encourage any young person to join their local disabled people's organisation. London particularly is a really vibrant community of disabled people's organisations. Um, Across the country, it's a bit patchy. Lots of disabled people's organisations have lost funding and so therefore have had to close. But I think ALLFIE, Alliance for Inclusive Education, is a national organisation of disabled people focused on inclusive education, as you know. But also ALLFIE is one of the few organisations that works to support disabled children and young people to understand their rights and to campaign for their rights. So I would really actively encourage disabled children and young people to contact ALLFIE, to become a member of ALLFIE. I'm not the director anymore, but I will be a lifelong member of ALLFIE because I will always support the work that ALLFIE does to campaign for inclusive education. But also, I would encourage disabled children and young people to find out more from ALLFIE about the work that ALLFIE does, because there's lots of training that ALLFIE does, but also ALLFIE will be really good at connecting young disabled people and with other young disabled people who want to get involved in this. But it first and foremost, we all have human rights. All of our human rights have to be protected and respected. And ALFIE can help disabled young people find out more about how to do that.
Thanks, Tara, so much for that.
No worries. All right. Take care. Bye bye bye.